Project Rift was never advertised as a weapon that could tear at whole areas. On paper, in the translated version of its charter, it was described as an experimental infrasound field generator for environmental testing. That phrase is the first betrayal in this file. The second is the way the pages keep pretending that walls, floors, and people are separate things once you let a sound low enough and wide enough into them. I understood that long before I reached the middle of the folder. The warning came on the inside of the cardboard cover, in the same kind of tired pencil handwriting I have started to recognize across multiple Cold War projects. No stamp, no signature, just a brief line in English translation, squeezed where only the archivist's eye usually goes. Field does not stop at equipment. Record only what can be believed. I have spent years reading lies dressed as reports, but I don't often see a confession written at the door. The official label on the spine is harmless enough. Project Rift, Acoustic Resonance Studies, Zone D9. The designation is dull, almost apologetic. No emblems, no heroic crests. Just a number and a word that feels accidental until you read what they were trying to do. The reading room where I opened it was as ordinary as ever. Fluorescent tubes humming, dust on the blinds, a radiator that sighs more than it heats. Outside, the city moved through its late afternoon routine. Cars, voices, the faint shriek of a train somewhere to the south. Inside, under that thin layer of white light, the past stretched out its fingers in the usual stack of gray folders. Project Rift did not look special until I opened it. The first page begins with a translation of the project aim: to construct and test a set of infrasound generators capable of producing controlled resonance fields over defined spatial volumes. They wanted, in simpler words, to build quiet storms, fields of pressure and vibration below the threshold of hearing, shaped not like beams or blasts, but like rooms, corridors, entire sections of landscape. Nothing in that was entirely new. Sound as a tool had been explored before and elsewhere. But Zone D9 was not trying to make a person faint or a bridge sway. They were trying to see what would happen if you treated an area, walls, air, occupants, wiring, foundations, as a single resonant body, and then persuaded all of it to move together in a way it had not agreed to. The facility was nowhere glamorous. A former industrial test hall repurposed after its original machines had been shipped elsewhere. Long, rectangular building, high ceiling, concrete floor with grids of anchor points where, once, heavy engines had been bolted down for stress trials. Now, those anchor points held different hardware. Metal frames carrying curved plates, thick pillars with hidden drivers, what the file simply calls emitter arrays. Pictures of them survive in grainy black and white photographs. They look like oversized loudspeakers whose faces have been turned inward, towards one another, forming invisible cages of air between them. The lab sat in a low valley shaped like a shallow bowl. The official reason was to reduce external noise. The unofficial advantage was line-of-sight isolation. You could run something loud and strange in that hollow, and the nearest village would only hear that the wind was up again. The origin story of Project Rift is told sideways, patched together from memos and requisition forms. It begins with a handful of vibroacoustic specialists who had been working on fatigue testing for materials, learning how metal and concrete fail under repeated subtle stress. It merges them with a quieter group whose official job was monitoring seismic noise, and whose unofficial job was asking what happens when such noise is not entirely natural. Somebody in a ministry, looking at both teams and at a map, decided that vibrations should be harmonized. The result was D9. What they had, to start with, was a set of mathematical models and some equipment that could shake things. What they lacked was the one thing you only get by trial and error: an intuition for what a whole building does when you treat it like a tuning fork. The early tests in the file are almost mundane. They begin with a single emitter on a bare concrete wall. They feed it long, slow pulses, barely more than pressure waves, and measure how the wall responds. The descriptions are cautious: minor surface flaking at extended exposure, hairline cracks in non-load-bearing partition, that sort of thing. Nothing tears, nothing falls. A few plaster patches crumble, instruments twitch. Everyone writes in the language of engineering, not fear. The KGB liaison present at that stage signs the pages without comment. Their margin notes are rare and unambitious. Requests for clarity, for justification of resource use. No one believes yet that Rift will be anything more than a mildly interesting report on why certain frequencies make pipes hum and others do not. The file changes tone the first time they decide to run the generators not against a single wall, but around a space. One of the lead scientists suggests setting up 4 emitter arrays at the corners of a square on the test hall floor, all aimed inward, all tuned to slightly different low frequencies whose interactions have been calculated to produce a standing pattern in the air and structure between them. The goal, in their own words, is to investigate the possibility of defining a contiguous volume of altered acoustic pressure. A room made of pressure inside a room made of brick. They clear the hall, chalk lines, place microphones, and vibration sensors in a grid. A technician walks through the space with a clipboard, noting positions. The day is ordinary. Cold outside. Damp inside. The air smelling faintly of oil from old uses of the building. When they start the generators, the first impression is not of sound at all. Several eyewitness accounts mention a change in weight. Not heavy, not light, just other. Like the subtle difference you feel in your body when an elevator stops after descending. Nothing moves, yet something inside the bones adjusts. The instruments begin to dance. Lines tremble on paper, needles flicker, gauges quiver. The 4 arrays each output a low, steady wave, but where the waves cross, things become complicated. Nodes, antinodes, dead spots, and hot spots. They had mapped all of this on paper. What they had not anticipated was how quickly the building itself would join the conversation. The concrete floor, the steel roof, the air ducts, even the soil under the foundations begin to contribute their own responses. Tiny echoes, delayed by fractions of a second, fold back into the field. The space between the machines grows thick with superimposed patterns, like ripples on a pond where someone keeps throwing stones. The technicians try walking the grid. Some report nothing more than a vague sense of pressure on the eardrums, like a storm front passing through. Others, following the same paths minutes later, stop mid-step and grip the edges of tables, saying they feel their internal organs slosh sideways by a centimeter, then settle. On paper, the trial is a success. They confirm that they can create a stable region where physical objects vibrate differently from those outside. A pencil, left on a table inside the defined zone, rolls a few millimeters towards one corner, against the slight incline of the surface. A suspended weight oscillates with a pattern that cannot be explained by the driving signal alone. The KGB notes become more attentive. One margin comment reads, "Potential to affect equipment and target structure without direct physical contact." Another, "Investigate effect on human morale under prolonged exposure." The project receives more funding. Additional arrays are requested. Shielding for sensitive instruments is ordered, not yet to protect them from damage, but to keep their own responses from cluttering the readings. Everyone believes they are still in the safe part of the map. The first real anomaly shows up in a set of tests that, at first glance, look unremarkable. They decide to calibrate how far beyond the central square the field extends. Microphones are placed not only inside the array but also along the hall's walls, in adjacent rooms, along the short corridor that leads to the exit. The generators are run at low power, then higher, the cycles extended. On one such day, a technician in the adjoining office writes that the pencil on his desk began to rattle. His coffee rippled in its cup. Papers fluttered slightly, though there was no draft. He assumed, reasonably, that someone had increased the output in the next room more than usual. What is odd is the timing. The records from the test hall show that, at the exact moment his pencil moved, the generators were not at peak. In fact, they had been stepped down between cycles. The main field should have been weaker, not stronger. Yet the sensors in the walls reported a surge. A spike in vibration in the structural pillars and ceiling beams, not matched by a corresponding rise at the emitter faces. The official summary calls it a transient amplification event in the building envelope. The staff, in conversation, called it the echo that came first. For a brief window, the edges of the structure rang harder than the center they were supposedly containing. After that, small things escalate. Doors jam during tests, not because their frames warp, but because the latch does not seem to know in which direction it should align. Light fixtures buzz with no power change. A fluorescent tube in the corridor flickers in perfect time with an inaudible rhythm, then returns to normal as soon as the field is switched off. Animals, when introduced, do not behave well. They start with mice in small cages placed just inside and just outside the test square. The idea is to compare behavior, grooming, movement, signs of stress. Mice outside the field act as mice do when moved to a new environment, exploring, sniffing, chewing. Mice inside the field huddle in corners, then lunge suddenly at empty air, as if defending space they cannot see. After several minutes, their movements become uncoordinated, not in the classic way of dizziness, but more like people walking through a room while the floor plan is being redrawn under their feet. Heart rate data shows elevated stress, but no cardiac collapse. When removed from the hall, most of the animals recover within the hour. A few keep turning their heads against the same bit of cage wall, as if expecting it to give way. The lab decides not to repeat the test with larger animals for the time being. They do it with people instead. Volunteers among the staff, some eager, some too proud to admit reluctance, are asked to stand at specific grid points inside the hall while the field runs at different strengths. They are told to report sensations, pressure, nausea, anxiety. The questionnaire results look like a collage. Some feel almost nothing. Others describe warmth in the chest, ringing in the ears, a sense of being watched. One, more articulate than the rest, writes, "Feels as if the room is breathing around me, but not in sync with my lungs." One of the KGB liaisons insists on experiencing the field firsthand. The record does not say whether he did this out of curiosity or suspicion. He stands in the center of the square, coat removed, sleeves rolled up as if to prove something about himself that the air does not care about. When the generators ramp up, he feels only pressure at first. His face tightens, not in fear, just in the physical response to a low, unseen wind. Then, according to his own later statement, his vision seems to flatten. Depth recedes. The hall looks for a few seconds like a photograph someone has pinned in front of his eyes. He reaches out to touch the nearest emitter frame and misjudges the distance badly enough that he stumbles against it with more force than intended. Afterward, he downplays the experience. His official note uses phrases like mild disorientation and no significant threat to functionality. The margin comment from one of the scientists reads differently. Subject's gait altered for remainder of day. Walked as if testing floor with each step. All of this builds, slowly, to the day the file calls the main anomaly trial. It was not meant to be dramatic. On paper, it was just another run, distinguished only by an attempt to push the coherence of the field further, to see whether they could create a stable region where the oscillations in walls, floor, and equipment marched together, in phase, instead of in the messy squabble of earlier tests. They adjusted the emitters, recalculated delays, compensated for the known quirks of the hall's construction. They taped additional sensors along the corridor and in the small monitoring room where the control board sat. They told non-essential personnel to stay clear. They did not evacuate the building. They did not warn the village. They were still thinking in terms of rooms, not whole areas. The trial began normally. Generators at low power, then rising. The now familiar shift in weight, the subtle complaint of the concrete. The hall's internal sounds, rustle of paper, creak of shoes, fell away under the unnoticed dominance of the field. In the monitoring room, a row of boards tracked various feeds. Vibration sensors, air pressure microphones, strain gauges in the pillars. Pens crawled across moving paper. Lines intersected, separated, thickened. At a certain point, as power increased, something like a lock clicked into place. The descriptions are frustratingly vague. No one writes the sentence I want, the one that says, cleanly, "At this moment, the field and the building became the same thing." Instead, I have to piece it together from their stumbles. One board shows a sudden drop in noise across all wall sensors, not because the walls have become still, but because they are moving in a way the system now reads as baseline. Another records an abrupt convergence in air pressure variations across the hall and corridor, as if doors, gaps, and corners no longer mattered. The irregular scribbles flatten into a single, thick line. A technician in the hall notes that the usual sense of heavier air has been replaced by something else. Feels like standing inside held breath. His words. In the monitoring room, the operators lean closer. Their boards, instead of showing a forest of different traces, begin to look almost identical. Vibration at floor sensor 1, vibration at floor sensor 5, pillar A, pillar D, the patterns all match. A shifting, almost regular wave rolling through all of them in the same rhythm. For several seconds, this is simply interesting. The data shows that they have finally achieved what they set out to do. The hall behaves as a single resonant body, the field wrapped through and around it like a net pulled taut. Then the field moves. Not the sound itself, that continues as a low, steady output from the emitters, but the zone of coherence. One moment, the hall is the center. The next, the corridor is, then the monitoring room, then somewhere that none of the equipment was meant to measure. On the boards, the lines shift in ways that do not correspond to any control action. Sensors that had been quiet begin to swing in unison. Others fall out of phase. The operator's first thought is a fault, a loose connection, a short, a calibration error. Then one of them realizes that his own heartbeat has synced with the wave on the nearest graph. He feels it in his chest. A slow swell, a pause, a slow swell again. Not the usual irregularity of a human pulse, but something more mechanical, more patient. He writes later that for a handful of beats, he did not know whether the rhythm in his body was his own or the building's. At the same time, in the hall, a technician drops a wrench. The sound arrives wrong. Not late, not early, just wrong. Too soft, as if the metal had fallen onto something that had agreed, for that moment, to catch it gently and spread the impact across a wider surface. He looks down, expecting to see insulation or padding. There is only bare concrete with a faint sheen of dust. The anomaly runs through the system like a deep breath being drawn in and held. The file estimates the duration of the coherent excursion at less than a minute. No one experienced that minute as short. Meters on the wall, which had been quivering in their usual jittery way, freeze at mid-scale, their needles held in place by nothing visible. Air in the corridor feels thick enough to lean on. Glass windows and internal doors bow slightly without cracking, as if pressure differences have become directional in a new, not yet properly named way. Then, as quickly as it locked in, the coherence breaks. The boards explode back into diversity. Lines separate, jitter, scribble. The needles on the meters snap to life, overshoot, then settle. Somewhere in the hall, a piece of old plaster finally gives up and falls in a small puff onto the floor. Papers, which had been lying oddly still despite the supposed agitation, flutter down from a table with the late realization that they are light. Nobody dies. Nobody screams. No visible tear opens in the air. No beam falls. On the surface, the trial can be written up as successful field generation with unexpected resonance artifacts. And that is exactly what the official report does. But people felt it. The technician in the hall writes that during the peak of the field, he was briefly convinced the space had been folded. Not physically, not with bending walls or impossible angles, but in the sense that walking forward or backward would no longer have taken him where the visible layout promised. The operator in the monitoring room notes that, while the lines on the boards were moving in lockstep, he could not tell which trace belonged to which sensor without looking at the labels. It was as if the building had stopped having separate parts, he writes, only one thing breathing slowly. The KGB liaison, observing from behind glass, records very little. That is its own kind of confession. His log for that day contains a single line: subjective impressions not reliable, objective data sufficient. One suspects that if he had truly believed the first sentence, he would not have needed to write it. After the anomaly trial, Project Rift enters a new phase: denial. On the surface, work continues. There are more tests, more graphs. The language reverts to technical calm. Field behavior within expected parameters plus minor anomalies. But threaded through the pages are signs that something essential has shifted in how the staff relate to the building and to one another. Several people start making small mistakes in their routine tasks, misplacing equipment by a few centimeters, misjudging distances when carrying trays, under or overstepping stair treads. These are minor incidents, easily blamed on fatigue. Yet the internal safety officer submits a note observing that such errors cluster on days when the field has been run at high coherence, even if those staff members were not physically present in the hall. He writes with admirable restraint, possible low-level cognitive effect beyond auditory range. Recommend monitoring for pattern. The medical officer at the facility, drawn reluctantly into the conversation, documents an uptick in complaints, headaches with no clear origin, feelings of being stretched, difficulty sleeping in certain rooms. One person describes waking in the middle of the night convinced that their bed has shifted closer to the wall, though the floorboards show no scuff. No one uses the word tearing. That would imply something dramatic and visible. What Rift seems to do when it reaches out beyond its own machinery is subtler and perhaps more insidious. It tugs at alignments, at how things settle into one another, at the unnoticed agreements between weight and support, expectation and touch. The more the field is run, the more the building behaves like an object that has been asked too many times to be more elastic than it was built to be. Hairline cracks appear where there were none before, not radiating from a single point of stress, but sprinkled across corners and joints, as if different parts of the structure had been momentarily misinformed about where down is. A metal shelf in a storage room gradually leans without warping, as if the anchors in the wall have migrated half a centimeter. When a spirit level is placed on it, the bubble sits just off-center in a way that is consistent, but still within tolerances. Building settling is the official diagnosis. Outside the valley, in the nearby village, nobody files reports under the word infrasound. They do, however, talk among themselves about the way sound carries differently on some evenings now. A dog's bark seems to arrive from the wrong street. The chime of the church bell stretches oddly on certain days, as if it were coming through a long tunnel. Children complain of heavy air near certain fences. None of this reaches the file directly. It slips in via an offhand remark in a logistics note. Local complaints about noise not justified by measured decibel levels. Possibly psychosomatic, related to increased security presence. The project leadership, perhaps sensing that they are approaching the limits of what can be written down without attracting the wrong sort of higher attention, begins to talk in two languages. In the formal reports, they describe field behavior within expected parameters plus minor anomalies. In meetings, according to one participant's later recollection, they speak more plainly. You can pull on a carpet so many times before something under the furniture breaks, one of the senior engineers is supposed to have said. We keep pulling, but the floor is under the carpet. Who signed off on that? The answer, of course, is in another file somewhere else. In the end, Project Rift's cover-up is not a dramatic night of destroyed documents and disappearing scientists. It is something more mundane, a slow starvation of context. Funding is reallocated. Key staff are promoted elsewhere. The equipment is ordered to be disassembled and shipped in pieces to different institutions, each receiving a harmless-looking component labeled for vibration testing or low-frequency research. The hall at Zone D9 is cleared. Its anchor points left empty again, the chalk lines mopped away. The final official entry in the folder is brief. Project Rift objectives partially met. Further development deemed non-priority under current strategic conditions. Facility to revert to general purpose testing role. It is the kind of language that can mean anything from success to quiet failure. If that were all, I would close the file with the faint disappointment of someone who has been promised a monster and handed only a pile of eccentric equations. But the people who handled this material were not all content to let it vanish that way. In the back of the folder, tucked between blank forms, are a few pages that should not be there. Personal notes, fragments of correspondence never sent, a sketch. One note, unsigned, reads, Observation. After main anomaly trial, it has become difficult to think of the valley and the hall as separate places. Walking outside, one feels echoes of interior layout and how sound behaves. A cough in the open field has the same hollow tail as a knock on the hall wall. This persists even when generators are inactive. Question: have we imprinted a field shape on the area itself? Another, from the medical officer, records a conversation with a villager who came to the facility's small clinic for unrelated reasons. While waiting, she remarked that her house doesn't sit right on the ground anymore. Pressed to explain, she said that when the wind hit from a certain direction, the walls seemed to lean away from it for a second, then remember their proper stance. No cracks, no visible movement, just a feeling in her bones that the entire structure sometimes hesitated. The sketch is perhaps the most unsettling item. Drawn in biro on lined paper, it shows the test hall and the surrounding valley from above. Over this, someone has traced a set of concentric, irregular shapes, like the outlines of a spill spreading outwards. At the center, the hall is shaded heavily. Further out, the lines thin. In the margin, the author has written, Not actual measurement. Psychological reach? Rough impression of where field felt strongest in later months, even when equipment off. In the bottom corner of the page is a single word, rift, underlined twice. A rift, after all, is not always a visible crack. Sometimes it is the invisible tension between parts that once fit and now do so only out of habit. Years later, people who worked in D9 and moved away report, when asked carefully, that they continue to experience small glitches in how they inhabit rooms. Turning a corner, they expect a corridor to be longer than it is. Standing in a new building, they misjudge the center of the space, as if an old blueprint is still being consulted somewhere out of sight. One engineer says that in particularly quiet houses, she can sometimes hear a hum that nobody else notices. A low, slow pulse that makes glasses in cupboards tingle almost silently. It feels like being back in the hall just before the field settled, she says. Except there is no hall, and nothing is supposed to be running. She has had her hearing checked. Everything is normal. I have never set foot in that valley. I know it only through maps and the occasional blurred photograph. In one image, taken long after the project was shut down, the building looks tired but intact. The roof has been patched. New doors have been installed. A different generation of trucks is parked near the loading bay. Yet something in the way the shadows fall in that picture is off. The trees on the slope cast long, usual shapes. The hall's own shadow is subtly skewed, as if the sun had been shining from a slightly different angle just for that footprint. It could be the camera. It could be my imagination, shaped by too many hours with this folder. Or it could be, as one of the anonymous notes suggests, that once you teach a piece of ground to behave like the inside of a resonance field, it never quite unlearns the trick. It is easy to say that Project Rift tried to tear at whole areas and failed because no city was flattened, no map redrawn. The laboratory did not crumble. The village did not vanish into a sinkhole. No satellite recorded a missing patch of countryside. But scale is a question of patience. If you nudge alignments far enough and often enough, tearing does not have to look like a single catastrophic break. It can look like a long sequence of small, persistent mismatches. Doors that never quite close cleanly again. Floors that tilt just enough to make cabinets lean. People who feel less at home in their own rooms than they used to. We live with these things easily. We call them bad construction, aging, drafts, nerves. We do not often ask whether somebody, somewhere, once pointed low machines at our foundations and asked them to breathe together. Much later in the stack, after the tables and politely worded conclusions, there is a proposal that almost no one outside the project ever saw. By then, the anomaly trial was behind them. The valley had become a place staff did not like to linger in after dark. And yet the instinct at the core of the system, to scale up, was still alive. The proposal is only a few pages long. It recommends field propagation beyond primary structure. In practice, that means taking what they have done to the hall and trying it on the valley itself. On the sketch, the idea is crude and simple. 4 new emitter sites on the slopes, wired back to the controller in the hall. Frequencies lowered, power redistributed, the pattern shaped so that the peak of coherence hangs somewhere in the open air above the roofs instead of in the test square. Someone has underlined one sentence. Objective. Determine point at which field ceases to be perceived as localized and is experienced as a change in environment as a whole. The KGB commentary is sharper than usual. One note points out that a valley-scale field cannot be kept inside fences. Another suggests unconventional methods of area denial and crowd control. A third, in smaller script, asks the only honest question on the page. What limits field once extended beyond laboratory infrastructure? In the end, only a reduced version is cleared. They install 2 slope arrays instead of 4, and tie them awkwardly into the existing hardware. The valley becomes, briefly, a half-finished instrument. On the day they run it, the sky is low and colorless. From outside, nothing obvious marks the start of the test. No sirens, no visible fog. The valley looks like any other hollow waiting for rain. Inside the hall, though, the sequence feels wrong before the main generators spool up. Usually, the staff feel the field build from the center outward, between the machines, in the air, then in the walls. This time, one technician writes, "It arrived through the floor first, like someone knocking from underneath." Sensors confirm that the first significant movement is not at the emitter faces, but in the outer pillars and trusses. They tighten and flex as if bracing for a remembered load. For a short period, seconds rather than minutes, the hall and valley pull against each other. The main arrays try to knit their neat square of altered pressure, while the slope units drag at the broader bowl of ground. The graphs from that day are ugly. Lines that usually run horizontally pick up faint curves, as if the paper were warping. For a few cycles, several traces show double shadows, as though 2 slightly different responses are trying to occupy the same line. Later, villagers talk about that hour in the loose way people remember weather. Nothing terrible happened, but details stick. Laundry lines went slack for a moment without the wind dropping. Someone heard their own footsteps arrive from half a step ahead. A kitchen cabinet door, long stiff, swung open on its own. and then refused to shut cleanly for days. The only time the word tier appears in any official context is in a maintenance log written the morning after. A worker notes a thin fracture in the concrete apron outside the east doorway, radiating from a point in midair rather than from an edge. "Looks like something tried to pull the slab outward around empty space," he writes, then let go. The valley test is never repeated. On paper, it is marked inconclusive and quietly abandoned. The external arrays are disconnected pending recalibration and left to rust. But from that point on, even small indoor runs are performed with a new caution that nobody admits in writing. People stand farther from the arrays. They check exits twice. A superstition takes hold that you should not stand directly under certain roof beams when the field is active, even though nothing has ever fallen from them. One engineer finally writes what others have been circling in his private notebook. His sentence survives only because someone later copied it into this file. "We built a field to act on a defined area and discovered the area has its own idea of where it ends. Our calculations stop at property lines. The valleys do not." By the time the order comes to wind rift down, the term tearing has shifted meaning. It no longer refers to dramatic structural failure. It shows up instead in casual complaints. Doors that used to close cleanly now scrape. Cupboard shelves that tilt just enough to slide plates. Beds that feel a few centimeters removed from where the floor insists they are. In the nearby village, a carpenter notes that nails bend more often in certain walls, as if the grain has twisted slightly away from itself. People blame all of this on poor materials, frost, bad luck. They live with it. But you can feel, in the last pages of the file, that the staff of D9 no longer experience the valley as a neutral container. It has become part of the machinery, a component that was once briefly driven in a way it was never designed for. One of the final KGB internal notes shows that even the watchers understood the danger for a moment. It recommends no further attempts to extend field beyond controlled structures, and cites not damage to equipment but possible alteration of felt geography among population, not predictable and not containable if similar projects are undertaken elsewhere. That clumsy phrase, felt geography, has stayed with me longer than any of the charts. It names the map you carry in your muscles and bones of how rooms hold you, how streets bend, where weight sits on a familiar staircase. Rift reached into that map, perhaps only faintly in one valley for a short time. But once you accept that such a reach is even possible, you cannot quite look at your own certainty about walls and floors the same way. Project Rift, judged by its own stated goals, did not redraw any maps. No bridges fell, no city blocks warped. If that is your definition of tearing at whole areas, then this file documents a failure. If instead you think of tearing as the slow loosening of the fit between people and the places they trust, then the story looks different. A valley where sound once ran in patterns no village was told about. A building that spent years learning to breathe with machines. A set of hands that still, decades later, reach half a step too far for familiar handles. The folder cannot say how many other attempts were made under other names, in other countries, with better funding and fewer qualms. It can only show you this one, a secluded hall, a handful of arrays, and a moment when the world inside a small valley agreed, very briefly, to move as a single object. At the very end, on the inside of the back cover, the same tired pencil that warned "Field" does not stop at equipment, has left a second line. It is almost erased by fingers and time. Translated, it reads, "The field does not care where we say inside ends and outside begins. It only asks what can move together, and what breaks when it tries. That is all. No morale, no recommendation. Just a closing observation from someone who watched a building act like one uneasy piece and understood that the real rift was never just in concrete or sound. It was between the way the world had behaved before and the way it might behave again if someone, somewhere, rebuilt those arrays in some other hollow and told the ground to listen."